All right, welcome back to another episode of This Week in AI Security, coming to for the week of the 21st of May, 2026. We have a ton to get through this week across a couple of different categories. So we're going to go through some of these stories pretty quick. And without further ado, let us dive in. So I want to open on the theme of offensive capabilities and how AI is being used out in the wild. So first is some information, a report from the Google Threat Intelligence Group, GTAG, about the first confirmed AI-generated zero-day exploit in the wild, which I think is a little bit of a funny way of thinking about it, but it is the first confirmed 2FA bypass used in exploitation. Basically, the GTIG caught cybercrime actors using an LLM to discover and weaponize a 2FA bypass in a popular open source admin tool. It's a high-level semantic logic bug with some hard-coded trust assumptions. These are exactly the kinds of problems that LLMs reportedly are very, very good at. And we're going to return to why I said reportedly here in just a minute here. But it's the kind of thing that traditional fuzzers and a lot of human examiners miss because it might require deeper, kind of in-depth inspection or chaining multiple conditions together. I think one of the interesting things from the team over at Watchtower, who also looked at this, was discovery, weaponization, and exploitation are faster. This is not heading towards compressed timelines. They're actually watching them compress. And so this is, kind of proof of this stuff being in the wild. Next story along this same theme. This is from the Palo Alto Unit 42, indirect prompt injection starting to be observed, quote unquote, at scale. Now, what at scale means is always kind of subject to interpretation, but we have covered on the show previously where any number of web pages are having embedded text that is very specifically targeted at LLMs. So sets of instructions that LLM web crawlers might be picking up that can lead to this kind of indirect prompt injection that we're talking about here. One of the interesting things is that they're seeing not just single instructions, but more kind of agent-oriented stuff. They had analyzed 22 distinct payload techniques identified: AI-based ad review evasion, SEO manipulation, promoting phishing sites, data destruction, unauthorized transactions, system prompt leakage. So some interesting stuff, again, being observed in the wild more from an offensive capabilities perspective. Transitioning from the offensive side to more of the, hey, let's identify vulnerabilities and improve our own security. An interesting report out of Microsoft about something called M-, the multimodal agent system that uses 100 plus specialized AI agents across multiple models that scan code and then, and this is the key, debate each other's findings. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting aspects of it. And of course, many organizations wouldn't have the resources to be able to do, 100 plus specialized agents engaging in debate, as opposed to, hey, I can only have the token budget for one that can go and scan, and maybe even just scan once, and it identifies issues that need to get fixed, etc. But back to their result, which is that it scored 88.45% on the UC Berkeley Cyber Gym benchmark, which is actually higher than Anthropic Mythos's score on that same benchmark. 16 new vulnerabilities in Windows networking and authentication stack, including a couple of critical RCEs in the TCP/IP stack, HTTP.sys, and a few different other things. 6 user mode kernel level issues patched in the May patch Tuesday. This debate thing is really interesting, and it kind of goes to something that we have discussed on the program before. There's often this question about who has the upper hand. Is it attackers? Is it defenders? Is it whoever uses AI best? Is it whoever uses AI first? And very often, one of the consistent results is that the combination of AI plus a human outperforms either one on their own. And this is some interesting proof that says, like, hey, actually LLM-based systems, multi-agent systems might be a really valid contender in the, who produces the best quality output. Actually combine that with the human, and maybe that is the direction that a lot of this stuff will be heading. So really interesting report. Moving on to our next one. So OpenAI kind of, not to, let's say, copycat the Mythos stuff, but they've got their own program called Daybreak. It is a program that is out there with a 3-tier model with GPT 5.5, GPT 5.5 Trusted Access for Cyber, TAC, and GPT 5.5 Cyber, which is a more permissive model that allows for red teaming, pen testing, Codex security as an agentic harness for automated vulnerability discovery and patch validation, already been integrated by a number of kind of larger key partners in the cybersecurity ecosystem, Akamai, Cisco, Cloudflare, et cetera, et cetera. So, really, again, kind of a response from them, some interesting stuff. So it looks like more and more of the frontier model developers are realizing that cyber capabilities are one of the most in-demand areas and probably one of the most immediately commercial opportunities as well. Moving on, and I mentioned at the beginning, quote unquote, reportedly around the capabilities of these models. There was a little bit of a pushback on the curl code base. And curl, for those who don't know, it's one of these underlying system commands inside Linux that allows the Linux operating system to pull down web pages. It is actually a mechanism used by a number of web browsers in the Linux world, and I think maybe even outside it in things like Mac OS and BSD based distributions that use that under the hood. And it's basically the way to do hypertext transfer, right? So it leverages the HTTP hypertext transfer protocol to suck down a web page, and then your browser renders it locally. Great. Well, Mythos is one of the most talked about capabilities in the cybersecurity world, and researchers took it and pointed it at the curl code base. And after review of a number of different bugs, Daniel Steinberg and his security team found only one real vulnerability that was not a false positive or already documented. And so one net new real vulnerability, and it was kind of categorized as low severity. And so Steinberg is calling it, quote, the greatest marketing stunt ever. But I think it's, something to think about. This is a very heavily fuzzed and audited code base. And so, you contrast that with a lot of organizations where they don't have that level of fuzzing and auditing. And, you might find a lot more novel stuff. I just thought it was an interesting kind of pushback, offering a different perspective on, how good these models really might be or not be for cyber capabilities, as the case may be. All right, moving on to our next story. This is a TanStack supply chain attack hitting OpenAI as well as a number of other vendors. So the Team PCP group compromised the TanStack NPM packages via a CI pipeline token theft. So not from phishing, but from a leaked token or a stolen token. 84 malicious versions published in a 6-minute window looking at the commit history. 2 OpenAI employee devices were hit. Credential material was exfiltrated from internal repos. OpenAI rotated all their code signing certificates for all Mac OS apps. So that's things like ChatGPT Desktop, the Codex app, the Codex CLI, and Atlas. And it is the second cert rotation in 2 months for them. The first was a North Korean compromise of the Axios library. We talked about that back in March. And the recommendation is obviously like update your operating system based tools that might be interacting with ChatGPT. So it's just, again, kind of a confirmation that not only are the models and the model providers, but all the kind of tooling around these things is part of the infrastructure that is a very high value and very prominent attack surface right now. We've got a number of stories on this theme as we kind of move on through today's episode. Next story, Praison AI vulnerability gets scanned within 4 hours of disclosure. So this is an AI agent framework called Praison AI. It's shipped with a Flask library that has a legacy API auth enabled equals false configuration. So meaning that this API is literally out there with no authentication if, as it was packaged at that time. And the interesting thing here is that, from the time it went live and some of the code base was published, this was scanned in less than 4 hours. So from the time it went online, within 3 hours, 44 minutes of the advisory publication of this CVE, this thing was scanned. So unauthenticated callers could invoke any configured AI workflow via this API, burn API quotas, et cetera, et cetera. And credit to the researcher Shmulik Cohen for discovery and disclosure on this one. So again, the infrastructure, the tooling around these systems is very often a high-value attack surface, and a high-value attack surface that has a lot of insecure defaults. So think about that. Moving on to the next one, this is around Google Cloud API keys. We talked before about how Google kind of silently changed scopes on a lot of API keys that were being used for things like embedded maps on websites and things like that. So attackers have been scraping keys from both GitHub repos, things like Nano Banana, VO3, image generation, model generation, file generation, things. And the keys belong to different organizations who are waking up to bills in the 10 to 50K range. Google automatically expands your spending limits, which kind of makes the damage worse for these organizations. Google cites this as an industry-wide problem and blames users for leaking keys, which I have to admit, there is some level of blame to be had. But I will again go back to kind of that change to API scopes as being one of the key challenges around that, because for a very, very long time, the guidance was these keys are not high-risk keys, right? So these are the kinds of credentials that you don't really need to worry about. These kind of, denial of wallet financial attacks are something to really watch out for. And I always do advise organizations who are looking at, hey, how do I monitor things like attacks and whatnot? Pay attention to your spend as one of the metrics that you're tracking as you look at that. It could be the case that AI adoption is really going up, or it could be the case that somebody's credentials or tokens have been compromised. All right, moving on, I want to give a special shout out to a personal friend and an organization that I know well, which is Fox Security, and Jason Cow over there for discovering an authorization bypass in Amazon Quick, which leads to unauthorized AI chat agent usage. And what this is that it's a critical missing server-side authorization check in the API for Amazon Quick. This dovetails into so many things that we've talked about on the show. APIs, it's always authentication, authorization, or input validation and sanitization. Those three things are always weaknesses in APIs that really lead to problems. And in this case, it was the API for Amazon Quick, by the way, formerly QuickSight, now just called Amazon Quick. Administrators could visually disable AI chat agents in the user interface, but the backdoor completely ignored these restrictions, allowing unauthenticated API requests to interact with the models directly. This is both an IAM blind spot as well as, again, something that could have kind of wallet impact. This functionality is not governed by a lot of traditional AWS IAM policies or service control policies, SCPs. So it's one of these services that kind of falls outside of the standard security controls. Again, the infrastructure around enablement is a valuable attack surface and something to watch out for. All right, moving on to our next story, which is a little bit of a philosophical one. And this is a research paper from a gentleman named Diego Carpintero, who is heading up something called the AI Engineering Summit, and had a talk around a zero trust architecture towards securing LLMs. And it's an academically oriented post, even though it is promoting an open source package around something called Modern BERT, which is an encoder architecture that is designed to work as something like an LLM firewall. The gist of it is the following thing, and we've talked on the show before about how LLMs don't understand your semantic intention. They operate on a token processing and a token prediction model, right? And so to that end, there is no way for an LLM to know that you are or are not trying to jailbreak or bypass, let's say, ethical guardrails or security controls that it might have. So to this end, one of the interesting proposals here is to go through this kind of encoding mechanism. And it has a few advantages also on things like performance and token utilization, and use this as a way to abstract away and do a semantic analysis before requests go to LLMs. It's a long read. It took me a while to get through, and I must admit, I might not have understand all the nuance here. So I'll just link this from the show notes, and we'll move on to our last story for the day, which is a macro or kind of a meta theme around this. We talked last year in our kind of state of AI and API security report about how vulnerability and vulnerability exploitation has finally now become the number one attack surface, surpassing things like phishing and credential theft. And that is confirmed in this year's Verizon DBIR, which is the Data Breach and Incident Response Report, or maybe Incident Report for 2026. This is the first year in the DBIR's 19 years of the DBIR publication that vulnerability exploitation has surpassed this. And the interesting thing to me is that it surpassed it not by like 1 or 2 percentage points, but by 18. So credential theft is now at 13% out of 22,000 confirmed breaches, whereas vulnerability exploitation is now at 31% of those breaches. We've talked about the 0-day clock. We've talked about many things. Bear this in mind. I'll leave you with that. Talk to you next week. Bye-bye.